Hey guys, Andrea Lynn here. So, this next interview, it's really good. Now, well, it could be controversial. I don't know. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts, but it was very expanding of my understanding of the content. What's the content? Well, let me tell you. So, I interview Beau Weingartz, who wrote along with Noah Carl, wrote a piece for Quillette reviewing, let me just look the name, a book called Superior, The Return of Race Science. They got quite a bit of backlash on Twitter, and I wanted to speak with Beau about his work and why he thought there was so much backlash. It was really very, very interesting information. And he let me play devil's advocate, coming up with all my reasons for maybe why this wouldn't be a good idea to look into, and he gave great answers as to why it is a good idea to look into. Anywho, guys, it's really, I just, let me know what you think. If I missed questions I should have asked, like, let me know if you agreed or disagreed. Anyway, let me know in the comments. But I'm going to stop talking and let you get to the interview. Hi, Beau. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
So, the reason why I wanted to chat with you is because you wrote an article and it was, I guess, branded controversial on Twitter, right?
That 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 would be a fair assessment. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so can you, there's a couple
First,
like
we should
backstory things.
let's give credit to my co-author.
That's what I was
Shout
going
out
to ask you
to Noah
next about.
Carl.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, who was your co-author?
My co-author was Noah Carl.
Okay, so there's a bit of a backstory with him as well. Can you tell me like, sort of his situation from the
I mean,
past year?
I'm honestly actually not an expert on it. I know
Okay.
that he was a postdoc there and he was fired after a 1 year stay because of writings that irritated enough people that they complained. Some of those writings they weren't about race really specifically, but
Mm-hmm.
rather that we should be able to study
Mm-hmm.
race differences in IQ.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
ironically, got fired for saying we should be able to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although it's not clear to me that that's exactly what happened, and he's understandably a bit reserved about it because of all sorts of issues. So I'll let him explain that. Yeah, he got fired, and obviously that's a problem.
How did he even come up in your head to like be a co-author with him for this?
Well, so that's actually interesting because he contacted me maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago or something,
Oh.
after reading a couple of my articles. I had written a peer-reviewed article on human population differences that I think he liked, and then at that time he was writing the article on race and IQ, and he asked me a few questions. I think he had me read the manuscript. I didn't even know who he was at the time. He just seemed like a decent dude.
Mm-hmm.
So we communicated a little bit, and then that was it. And then I sent him an email when he was going through all of the threats. This was before he was fired, and just said, I've got your back or whatever. And he said thanks, and that was it. And
Mm-hmm.
then he got fired, and I sent him another email. And then I just got an email, and he said, "Hey, are you going to write a review about this book?" This was the Angela Saini book that we eventually wrote a review on. And I said, "I was actually thinking about it. Do you want to help me?" And so I actually didn't know him very well
Mm-hmm.
before that. And then we Skyped a few times and chatted and wrote this thing together. And now I'm friendly with him.
Okay. So the article, if you could just, you mentioned it briefly. Can you go over? So this article is a review.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a review of a book by Angela Saini called Superior, The Return of Race Science. And it's actually hard to describe the thesis of the book because it's not entirely clear, but it's a pretty negative look at quote unquote race science. And
Okay.
so, yeah, our article is a review of that, but I think it's fair to say that we use the book as kind of a platform to make a broader point about studying racial variation.
Mm-hmm.
about studying and talking about it openly and honestly.
Okay, so there are two things I want to cover specifically. First, for those who might not know the history of race science, can you tell me why people are concerned?
Well, so if you read Saney's version, that's a lot different from the version I would tell. Her version is that it was basically this pernicious pseudoscience from almost the very beginning. My version would be a lot different from that. However, it is undoubtedly true that some people who have been interested in quote unquote race science, I don't even like the term race science,
What
let's
would
say,
you call it?
I mean, I would just call it studying human variation,
Okay.
or Stephen Saylor called it human biodiversity, but that's become kind of political now.
Okay.
So let's say, studying human diversity. It's undoubtedly true that there were some, I guess you could call them malicious figures who attempted to justify despicable worldviews by using pseudoscience, right? That's
Right.
true. However, I think by and large, most people, well, maybe that's unfair. Let's say this, a lot of people who have studied human variation were honestly just interested in human variation and have attempted to understand it. And they've attempted to understand it the way you would attempt to understand anything. Now, those people had the same biases as other people at the time. So if you read somebody writing about, say, black and white differences in 1920, it certainly is offensive to our sensibilities, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if we read it now and we're like, ugh, you wouldn't say it that way. That's pretty crude. But I don't see evidence that most of the people studying it were any more racist than the average person at the time,
At the
right?
time.
Yeah, or F. Scott Fitzgerald was, or something, you know? So I think the contention from somebody like Saney and a lot of other people, obviously, as I'm sure we'll get into, is basically that this kind of science, the only purpose that it had was to justify European colonialism, imperialism, and then to justify Jim Crow, American slavery first, and then Jim Crow, and now whatever pernicious prejudices people have in the alt-right, etc. That's their view of it. My view of it is it's an incredibly fascinating topic that one can hardly avoid if one is interested in human evolution, because it's just a fact about human evolution and humans.
Right.
And there are other reasons that I can get into why I find it interesting, but I think most of the people who are interested in the topic now are perfectly decent humans. Are some of them racist? Yeah, probably. Are some liberals racist? Yeah, probably. I don't think that's the sort of motivating it's not the chief motivation of most people who study the topic today. I don't think, at least. I see no evidence that it is.
It seems like people use the it's a slippery slope argument. Like, well, the Nazis were doing this with the Aryan
Yeah,
race. It's a slippery slope. Like, I do think that is where because we have seen these things be used in the past, like you said, by sort of totalitarian type regime.
yeah. I mean, certainly unsavory. I mean, although it's interesting, right? Because the Nazi Party's chief ideological enemy, well, not ideological, chief like enemy of their ideology was Jewish people who score higher than non-Jewish European whites on intelligence tests. And in fact, Hitler, it's hard to get information on this. I tried to look at this carefully. It seems to be the case that Hitler was not a fan of intelligence tests precisely because Jewish people scored higher on them. It
Right.
doesn't, it, Yes, it's interesting. Also seems to be the case, although again, this is something that I couldn't confirm, and I'm not a scholar of Nazi Germany,
Hmm.
so I don't want listeners to think I'm some scholar here or something. But it seems to be the case that although they called Jewish people like diseased and all kinds of slanderous
Yeah.
names, they never really seemed to say that they were like inferior in traits in some way, right? Like that they didn't claim that they were less intelligent or something.
They just
That
really
doesn't.
pushed the Aryan race
Yeah,
as
the Aryan
better.
race was better for various reasons, and I think they had an idea that Jewish people were, they weren't nationalistic, they were usurers because they were global bankers, they weren't patriotic, they were the reason that they lost the war, lots of different things, but it doesn't seem, I mean, again, there's not a lot of literature on this as far because I really looked into this. But anyway, I guess it doesn't matter because look, like the Soviet Union during the communist era had environmentalist beliefs about human nature. They thought that humans were remarkably flexible, right? And they killed lots of people. Many millions of their own people died.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people today are like, well, if you study environmental causes of behavior, you might, lead to the next communist slaughter.
Oh, I see. Okay, so yeah, like people aren't concerned about that because it doesn't
Yeah,
stand out in our collective consciousness, I guess.
I mean, I think there really is just kind of like a political bias because most scholars tend to be liberal to progressive and therefore they're at least moderately sympathetic to the goals of socialism. I'm not saying they're fans of like Stalinist Russia, but
Hmm.
because they are more sympathetic to the goals of socialism, they don't see that, they just don't think about that as
Right.
being like, but when you look at mass slaughter in the 20th century, the examples that stand out are Stalin's Russia, Mao Zedong's China, and Hitler's Germany.
Hmm.
Two of the three were basically environmentalist ideologies.
Hmm.
But
So can you
Mao,
explain environmentalist ideology?
sure. I don't think any environmentalist believes that humans are 100% shaped by the environment, but I guess the view is most of the causes of human behavior and most of the causes of differences between humans or among humans are environmental. That is, they don't stem from genetic causes. They're not intrinsic, if you
Right.
will. They come from the environment, from economic forces, if you're a Marxist, or
Right.
maybe social construction, if you're postmodernist or whatever. I guess as opposed to what I would be, which is a hereditarian, that is to say, I think somewhere between 30 and 80% of the variance in human traits is caused by genetics, including traits between human population groups and within the groups. So
Okay.
it's so I mean, like I'm simplifying, but you can think of it on a continuum, right? From pure environmentalist, which is like maybe John Watson, the behaviorist, gets about as close as you could get to that, to pure 100% genetics. I don't know anybody who's ever believed that, right? But there's this continuum. Environmentalists are on the one side, hereditarians are on the other.
Okay. So what I do want to get into the actual like article, but well, maybe I should
Sure.
wait. I do want to know why you think it's a concern to not study it, or why you think we should study it, but we could maybe do that at the end, which I don't know which order you'd prefer. That's in the article. You mentioned you're concerned about
Yeah.
not
So,
studying.
so you're like, do we want to cover the substance? Let's cover the substance
Okay.
first.
Yeah, I was kind of
Okay.
thinking that. I think I'm getting ahead of myself
Yeah.
here. So
Okay.
let's just, what is the name of your article in Quillette?
Uh, as I remember, it's the very creative name, a review of Angela
Okay.
S's The Return of Race
Okay,
Science.
I'll link it. I'll link it in the
Okay.
in the description there.
I think
Okay.
that's it. I think it's just a review of
A review.
Superior.
Okay. So can you go through a little bit about, I do want to get to like the backlash on Twitter and like my other
Sure.
question, but so can you just give
Mhm.
a summary of why you disagreed with her premise that is kind of hard to pin down?
Yeah, well, so that's the hard thing because there are a couple of things we disagreed with. So I'm trying to think of like what are the best ones to go over. So she seems to argue. I mean, so it's really hard to figure out exactly what she's saying, but she seems to argue that it's there really isn't a way to classify human variation into racial groups. So like it's just illegitimate to do so, and she makes some pretty standard and what I think are fallacious arguments about why humans can't be sorted into racial groups. This is actually the particular argument I spent the most time on Twitter trying
Okay.
to which is, I lament that I did because it's a huge waste of time.
Hey, but
The second,
I do have a question. Is it can't or shouldn't?
can't.
Can't.
Yes.
Okay.
So can't. And the argument, I mean, it's hard to say how seriously the people who forward it take it. I can't tell. But there are a couple arguments. One is human variation within humans is so much greater than variation between human groups that the between group variation is just utterly uninteresting, right? And this actually comes from a population geneticist named Richard Lewontin, who first forwarded this argument. It's been refuted numerous times. It's actually literally called Lewontin's fallacy now, because basically what he did, without getting into the technical details about the genetics here, is he looked at the difference between like one gene's locus, so you call these alleles. He looked at these differences one at a time and said, how much of these are within and between? And then he said, well, it turns out like it's a very small percentage that's between groups, and therefore race is of little taxonomic significance, is what he says.
Right.
But as has been pointed out by a lot of people, AWF, I think Tony Edwards, most famously, if you take all of these differences and you look at them as they're correlated, you notice a pattern, right? So it's like, yes, this one's a little different, this one's different, this one's different, and it's not much. But when you correlate them, there's a very discernible pattern. So the analogy that we used in the article, which I think is a good one.
Faces, right?
The face, exactly. Mm-hmm. If you think about sex differences in the human face, okay, well, if you take one trait at a time, say lip size, it's really hard to classify a face by lip size. There are slight differences, but not much. But if you look at all of the traits at the same time, it turns out we can classify human faces by sex at, I think, above 95% accuracy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at the pattern. That's the key. And after all, as I said to these people, like when you interact with different members of different racial groups, you're not interacting with one trait at a time. You're interacting with a constellation of traits. Right. This is why normal people can classify people into racial groups pretty easily.
Yes, it almost seems like an intellectualization of.
It is. There was a geneticist. I think his name was David Licken. He was. I think he's dead now, unfortunately. He was University of Minnesota, and he said, I can't remember what he was referring to, but he said that is an idea it's an idea that's so ludicrous that only a mind thoroughly debauched by education could believe it. Yeah. And I think that's going on here. Like, if you talk to the average person, like I have friends who are not interested in academics, and they're just like, yeah, no, of course there are races, right? But if you talk to academics, they sincerely, again, like it's hard to know how much of this is sincere and how much of it is political, and we can talk about that. But mm-hmm. I think a lot of them sincerely believe this because they've intellectualized it so much that they come up with all these weird arguments about it, and it's excessively intellectualized.
Okay, so sorry, I totally interrupted you by asking it can't or should. So you were just going through a bit of your argument as to why you disagreed with the can't. And then, so that was one argument. Another one that the one that stood out to me the most, I think it was the final argument you made, that she's saying using the words race science, I think, is racist.
Yeah, she's basically saying, I mean, it's not clear if she ever makes the assertion. She certainly insinuates that just studying race differences is racist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And especially asserting that there are, significant race differences in cognition, cognitive ability, or personality traits, etc., is definitely, from her perspective, racist. Just mm-hmm. ipso facto racist. And this is something that Carl, it would be better to talk to about. This is kind of like his baby, if you will. He's written a couple papers about it, and I think argued very cogently that not only is that fallacious, but it's also in some sense dangerous because it suggests that if there were differences, then it would be maybe okay to treat people differently or to not treat people with equal moral dignity. And I think
And
that
that's
that's
what they're
the
worried about. Like they're
that's what
worried
they're
about
worried
that.
about.
Yeah.
But then they're like sort of making it the case that it's like an empirical question. And this is interesting because I had a protracted and cordial discussion on Twitter with somebody about they were asking me why do I care about cognitive differences between groups? And I said, well, for one thing, it's just interesting, but for another, it's really important to understand it because you can't understand if something's discrimination or if it's just an outcome of natural abilities unless you know what the abilities are. And they started saying, well, aren't you? I mean, that's basically they were saying if you're saying a group is superior to another group, and I said no, I would never use that term. That's a it's a value judgment that's divisive and unnecessarily so. I think we can make a distinction between are they better at X trait or Y trait? Is this group on average better? And should these groups be treated morally or ethically similarly, which is more of a moral metaphysical question, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, that kind of goes out of the findings range of what the science says, and then what should we
Right,
do with how should we
right.
interpret this data?
Exactly, exactly. It's a moral question. I'm a, I'm a scientist. I care about what's true. I mean,
Mm,
I like philosophy and I obviously dabble in it, but it's odd because anytime, so I've given talks on race differences in IQ, and I've communicated with individuals about it, and I'm always asked, well, what should we do about this morally? And I'm like, I don't know. I honestly don't. I'm not a moral philosopher. I think the first thing we should do is address reality, discover the truth. That's what my job is to forward the truth as best as I can, and that's
hmm.
what I try to do. Now, I can speculate about what it should mean, and I have before, but it's just odd that that's always the question that you're asked, as if I'm some kind of expert on that, and I'm not. I'm not a moral expert.
It brings it kind of has a meaning attached, because I was kind of considering like I guess I can ask you how you think this would go. The alien coming and studying us without any
Hmm.
prior worries or attachments as to what something would mean if you discover
Right,
something, which is
right.
basically us studying different populations of animals or plants, right? We're
Yeah,
not
exactly.
concerned, right? So
Yeah.
what would the alien be like? Well, we better not, like, we don't need to know this. Like, what would that look like? Like, how would they go about coming and studying us in that sort of a way?
Right, especially something, these, I mean, like, I would think that if you were the sort of proverbial Martian scientist, right, you would notice human variation right away. It would be
Hmm.
like, wow, there are fascinating differences among human groups, and you would really want to study that. So yeah, and I actually say this to my students. I say, we have to learn to separate the facts and the values, and then we should study humans the same way we would study beavers or squirrels or toads. We,
Okay.
we don't have these like ethical. Now, that doesn't mean that afterward we shouldn't talk about the morals and the ethics. Of course we should. That's why we have moral philosophy. That's why people really care about that stuff. I understand it. But as scientists, qua scientists, right, we should study humans the way we study toads.
Okay.
I really think that. I think I think people believe moral values and being moral about things and moralizing things. They believe those things are always good. Like it can't be bad to be excessively moral. But the fact is, I think it's bad. Moralizing things is actually often bad. It doesn't lead to better outcomes. In fact, it leads to worse outcomes. It prevents people from understanding the truth. And in fact, there are many revolutions that were built on excessive moral fervor, the French Revolution, etc. So it's not clear that being excessively moral is the better thing to do. And as scientists, I think we should actually strive not to be moral, just to look at look, if you're a nuclear scientist and you could release information and somebody can make a bomb out of it, okay, that's a little bit different, right? But for the most part, what I'm doing, I think we should just leave morals out of it.
Okay. So I have two questions. One of them is, do you study intelligence in different species of animals? Is that like I know that I don't know. Is that something that is studied? Say, well, dog breeds.
It is actually studied.
Okay.
There is like a general intelligence factor in some other animals that people look at, and especially like take dogs, for example. Yeah. There are various systems of judging dog intelligence, if you will. I don't, I mean, I know a little bit about it. I don't particularly study it. But people do. People can and they do.
Okay, so I'm trying to just sort of establish that it's not like people don't study intelligence in other animals, but we only want to know for humans. No, this is studied. It is a thing.
Yes, absolutely studied.
Okay,
yes.
It is an area of study. Okay, and can you go over a little bit about? Oh, sorry, Beau, I should have asked this at the very beginning. I'll put it in the intro, but like what your specialty is.
I don't have a specialty. So I got my PhD's in social psychology.
Okay.
Under Roy Baumeister, but I would not consider myself a social psychologist. I would consider myself an evolutionary biologist who's more interested in like genetics and more biologically based psychology, I guess.
Okay. So so can you talk about this? I don't know if it's a movement or if it's always been about sort of the belief in human evolution up until here. And then you're like, up until the neck, I guess.
Up until there.
Yeah. So if you could explain this is prevalent in, I guess, the social sciences.
Oh, very, very much so. People have called this various things. So people have called it liberal creationism because it's basically the idea that all human brains are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I call it selective dualism, which has kind of two meanings. It's like, basically, one, these people are apparently dualists and they think the mind is like somehow separate from the brain. And two, they think that, the human body is subject to selective pressures, but somehow the brain's not. So there's this kind of dualistic world in which the rest of the phenotype is subject to these selection pressures, but the human brain somehow is impervious to them. It's really odd because there are actually mainstream textbooks on human variation. Now, it's interesting because both of the textbooks, Molnar, and then the other one is, I think, Mielke. There are three authors on that one. They both start out with saying, like, why racial categories don't work, which is, and they're both, like, terrible chapters. Then they go over some stuff that's interesting, like blood, antigen differences, etc. And then they get to the psychological part and they just say all of the psychological differences that people have proposed are definitely wrong. And it's so, because it's like, okay, if the body's different and the blood systems are different on average, and you can, skin color differences, lactose tolerance, altitude adaptations, all of these different adaptations. But when you say anything about a psychological trait, people say, no, couldn't be. And it's just like, well, why not? I mean, I've never really seen somebody forward a good argument about why the human brain would somehow not be subject to natural selection the same way any other organ is. I mean, I guess some people have tried. So I guess like Kevin Mitchell has argued that basically the human adaptation is to culture. And so we're so flexible that there's no reason to have cognitive differences, say, if you're in Africa and you're in Europe, you solve all of the problems culturally, but that's just manifestly untrue because Europeans look different. So they didn't solve all of their problems through culture, right?
Oh, because if there was, then they would look the same from
exactly,
when we left Africa.
Presumably the argument would be, well, you wouldn't have lighter skin or lighter hair or anything because you would solve all the problems that you faced in Europe via cultural implements. And clearly that's not the case. So
Right.
the notion that you wouldn't also evolve slightly different psychological propensities just strikes me as absurd on the face. I really don't understand this. It's seriously an odd.
Yeah,
You
I'm even imagining, people who say live in the northern hemisphere, like say the Inuit in, northern Canada. Like they
right?
literally have to deal with no sunlight for half the year or barely any. And
Yeah.
then say people who
Oh,
live in very sunny environments. And so yes, their physical, I guess, they're the genetics that have been passed down of those who do the best via natural selection, those that shows up in their, even just their stature and their ability to stay
yeah,
their right to
exactly. They have a different stature. They have different fat deposits.
right,
They appear to be adapted to I forget the exact technical term, but like basically a diet that's heavy in certain fatty acids because
because it mostly
you're
meats and
not eating a lot
fats.
of plants. Exactly.
Yes, so if they were, why wouldn't they also be adapted, I guess, almost emotionally? This
Yeah,
would be
or
an interesting thing to
psychological.
study. Are they against, like, is there sort of a depression inhibitor? I don't know. For with
Yeah,
regard to the sunlight thing, right? Like the
right.
lack of sunlight. And I don't know. Maybe there's nothing like that, but there
Oh, I
might
don't
be.
know if there is either. It's not silly though, right? This is the thing that strikes me is you say that. You're like, okay, maybe there might be this. My reaction to that is, yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. Maybe it's not. I'd have to think about it for a bit, but it
Hmm.
seems reasonable. Why shouldn't we test that?
Hmm.
Right? Right? And this is the thing that boggles my mind about this kind of liberal creationism is it literally like cuts off legitimate hypotheses at the neck. And like all
Right.
of a sudden, if you even say, hey, I wonder if like this group is more cooperative on average because they faced way harsher winters and they had to work together.
Hmm.
It's not even a legitimate hypothesis anymore, which is just so odd because it seems to me quite clearly that it is.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about what happened on Twitter?
Yeah,
Like,
yes.
can we go? I mean, you did mention one argument particularly, but that sounded pretty like a genuine. I think the question was like, so why do we need to do this at all? Was that the question that you talked about?
Well, yeah,
You
so
brought one up.
that was one. Okay, so I would almost break it into three.
Okay.
One was this weird claim that we were trying to bring phrenology back. And this was a
Okay.
very popular claim, tweeted out by none other than Jamal Bowie, who writes for the New York Times and used to be at Slate. I don't know if he's still at Slate. But he tweeted this out, and it's so manifestly preposterous. It's
Can
just
you
like,
explain what phrenology is?
yeah, so phrenology was it was the study of personality via the skull. So people would attempt to
Right.
measure the skull, the
Oh.
various bumps or
Yeah.
whatever, and they say that these correlated with personality trait. So what happened was we literally put only two sentences in this thing, and it was just about the ability of people to classify skulls by race. And
Okay.
so it turns out that people are very good. Well, people, computer programs, whatever. Researchers are very good at classifying skulls into black and white. They can do so very accurately. They can also classify by region, although not quite as accurately. And there's a lot of gradual variation. It's not perfect. But our point was just, look, we can classify these things, and here's just one example of doing it with the skull. It was two sentences. Somehow the fact that we put skulls in there became we were proponents of phrenology.
Okay.
I mean, that was just this weird thing. So I don't know how that happened. I think it was basically it's hard not to
Misreading.
see it as like an unsympathetic attempt to besmirch us just by
Mm-hmm.
associating us with some pseudoscience.
Okay.
Then there was the arguments about can you classify people in races,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was the should you do it? Why are you doing this? What's the point of it? Why do you study it? Right?
Okay. So we've done the can you. We've already gone through that. So the
I think we
should
can.
you. Yeah. So I imagine that the should you one is where there's a lot of, I guess, political rhetoric?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I think the can is also linked to the should because honestly, if it weren't for the should part, nobody would be arguing about the can because it's so obvious that you can.
Okay.
And that's what really bothers me about the argument is it's such a distraction from more important things. Like nobody would debate this if we didn't care about it. So, but
Okay.
let's get to the should you. Um, I'm a little more sympathetic to that because at least it's an honest debate. You know,
Right.
at least we're talking about the actual topic. I think, of course, you should be able to, and I think that it's a huge mistake tactically and morally. Well, maybe let's leave the moral out. It's tactically it's a mistake because you you can't silence the truth. Like it's just not a very feasible thing to think that you will be able to enforce a regime of silence that protects this noble lie that there are no differences. It's not only is it costly to attempt to enforce this thing because you're going to have to punish people who violate it, but it also prevents us from understanding real differences and from trying to tackle those problems. You can't solve a problem unless you well, let me rephrase that. You can solve problems without knowing the cause. Sometimes we just get lucky, etc. But it's easier to solve a problem if we know the cause. So
Okay.
I don't know why you wouldn't want to know the actual cause of disparities in society. It's boggling to me that you wouldn't want to know that.
Okay. What if people, okay, actually, this brings up a question that I would have if I was, say, trying to see that other side, like the devil's advocate.
Sure.
So, what if we say, yes, we imagine there are differences?
Mm-hmm.
We'll just agree that there probably are. We don't know them. Why
All
must
right.
we know them? And you gave a few answers earlier, but like it could do more harm than good. So let's just like, okay, so say I don't want to know what my personal IQ is. Just
Sure.
imagine that. Because like
Yeah.
why like will it really alter how I like am, in my life? Or like I feel like it almost would be maybe a hindrance if it's like, oh, it's really high. I guess I feel amazing and prideful, whatever. Or if it's like, oh, it's
Yeah.
super low. I guess I'm a big dummy. Like,
Right.
right?
Right.
I feel like it would mess with my head. So I don't really want to know. So I'm going to apply that to population differences in IQ.
So I think that the individual and the group is much different. So I'll give you a different example. I don't think that I should walk up to a woman on the street and say, "Hey, you're about a 6." I think it would be, right? Like I think that would
Okay.
be pretty rude to do. And
Okay.
if people don't want to know their own ratings, I don't blame them. I don't want to know mine.
Okay.
But I think it would be odd to go from that to we shouldn't be able to study attractiveness or why people like certain women and not other women or certain men and not other men, right? I think
Is that
it,
studied?
oh, absolutely, yeah.
That
People
seems like
study.
it would be problematic as well nowadays, but yeah.
Yeah, I think because it's so undeniable that obviously some people are more attractive than others.
You'd
So
think for race as well, though.
well, but if you okay, so it is a few people have attempted to look at race differences in attractiveness, and that does get you in trouble. Nobody wants to hear that.
Okay.
So, so
Oh, okay. So
they
let's go
don't.
there. Okay, let's. Okay,
No,
okay.
let's not.
No, but
Let's
like,
not.
why I would not want to? Like, that seems like, do we need to know? So you're agreeing we don't need to know that?
No, I'm not. I'm trying not to get myself in trouble.
Okay.
So like I have only so much intellectual capital I can spend, and
Okay,
I'm spending
but
as
okay,
much as I have.
that is a good. Because I am trying to see the other side because I am a very big proponent of is does not equal an ought and is can inform
Hmm.
us so we can then
Agree.
make informed oughts, I suppose.
I agree with that.
But I'm on that side with you. So I'm trying to get to where the other side is coming from. So that is a really like must we know race attractive differences? How could that even be helpful? That's an obvious one to me that seems like, why do we even need to know that? Like what I'm saying about for my own individual, I guess, IQ, applying it across the board, I can see why you're saying like we don't need to know our individuals. That's something that you don't have to worry about, but we could study on population levels. But like there are some categories that do seem, well, even if we admit there could be differences, must we study them? Is this because science is like because we must? Like,
Well, okay, so that it's really hard because
am I making sense where I'm trying to go?
yeah, no, you're making complete
Okay.
sense. The thing is, like, I don't get offended by anything. So if somebody started talking to me about race differences and attractiveness, it wouldn't bother me. I'd be like, yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk about it.
Okay.
However, I understand that it's very offensive publicly. And I do, believe it or not, I have some concern about public opinion. And so I only want to, like, I'm picking and choosing. If people could handle it, I'd have no problem talking about it. And I don't have a problem with other people studying it because, frankly, it's kind of interesting,
Okay.
right? I think it's interesting. I don't know why somebody wouldn't be interested
What
in
would be
that.
the utility of knowing?
Well, okay, but that's a separate question. So I suppose one question is it humanly interesting, right? So what's the utility of knowing about a squirrel? I don't know. It's interesting to me. I like to know about squirrel behavior. I
I'm
don't
going
know if
from
it
the
has
more harm than good perspective then.
okay, sure. Yeah. So you're saying,
It could do
I
more
mean,
harm than good.
we just, okay, the problem with that kind of an assessment, I'm not a truth absolutist because I'm basically a utilitarian. So if you could show me, if you had a magic crystal ball and you could show me, look, if you keep studying race differences in X, it's going to be worse. I'll show you. I would say, all right, I'm not going to do it. But I don't think that that's the case. And I think generally what we should do, because it's so hard to foresee the consequences of any intellectual endeavor, therefore, what we should do, instead of putting the burden on scientists, we should put the burden on the consumers of science and say, is off, separate the two and learn to deal with it.
Okay.
If you're not in like the fact, this is what kind of bothers me. We've created, and I sympathize with this too, because I had a lot of hard times dealing with some of these issues and thinking them through. It caused me great pain. I think people probably think I'm like some cold-hearted person who just like, who cares? I'll just calculate and measure a skull. I'm not.
You're like, yeah, I
But I
could see
think,
you with your instruments just
right,
measuring.
exactly. My calipers doing whatever. But the thing is, I'm really not. And like, this caused me some pain, and I've thought about it very carefully. But I think I lost my. Oh, we're creating these people. We're indulging people who are attempting to interfere with the process of learning about the world. That's what really bothers me. It's no different. I wish these people would see it. It's no different from indulging religious zealots, right? They think they're different, but they're not.
Okay.
They're religious zealots who are interfering with the pursuit of knowledge. And that is what bothers me. We should not indulge that. We should talk to their concerns. That's fine. Let's have the talk about concerns, what you're saying, like your concerns, or at least you're pretending to have concerns for the sake of a debate, which is good. We should talk about that. What we shouldn't do is silence ourselves because certain people have been taught that if they whine loud enough about it, then we'll give up on it. That is not how things should work. And we can see, the thing is, we can see this very clearly when we look in the past. If you look at, say, Darwinism, the people today laugh that the creationists were trying to stop it from being taught in school, right? If you talk to these people who were ridiculing me and Noah, a lot of them would ridicule creationists and mock them for attempting to keep natural selection out of textbooks. I would ask those people, what would you do if we started putting race differences in textbooks? Those people would then become the creationists. They would be crying about it and saying we shouldn't teach it, etc.
Okay.
I think what's the best to do is teach people that we can separate facts and values, and that scientists pursue the truth regardless of how it feels, and then we can deal with that as a humane civil society. That's what I think would be the best course.
The way that you're explaining it does make sense, and it seems like people are assigning a value to these differences. See, even if we think difference, but they're thinking difference, right? Like higher and lower versus like you're like diversity as in like a sort of like more horizontal versus like vertical. And I guess particularly IQ comes up, but that's because that's what's being brought up. But there are so many different, I suppose, I guess psychological or cognitive different things that can be measured that some might be better here and some might be better here. And by better, it doesn't mean better, just varied. Is it, I guess it's the values assessment versus just the science of this is the fact of what it is. Does that sound like what people are doing?
Sure. I mean, like, to be clear, I think, like, everyone would rather be smarter, I think. I mean, I don't think I know anybody who's like, you know what, I wish I were less intelligent than I am.
Right.
Same thing with good looks. Like, look, I wish I looked like Brad Pitt in Fight Club.
Yeah.
You know, if I could look like that Brad Pitt, like that's a 10. I'm gonna say that's like the best looking you could possibly be.
Okay.
Yeah, I would rather look like that. I would rather be as good as Steph Curry is at basketball. So like, look, some of these things are socially valued, and I think we should be honest about that. And like, yes, if you say, look, there is likely to be a genetically caused disparity between certain groups in IQ, such that, say, Asians are a little smarter and blacks are a little less intelligent, and part of that's genetic. People don't like that, and I understand that because, yes, like, I presume most people would rather be higher in intelligence. The world just didn't work out that way, right? Ashkenazi Jews are the most intelligent group, right? Europeans are not as intelligent as they are. Okay. I mean, I'm sure most Europeans, if they got together, non-Jewish Europeans would be like, hey, could we be smarter? You know, if there were like a God that made us, we would be like, hey, cool, it'd be cool if you made us a little smarter.
Right.
Okay, but that didn't happen. So we have to accept reality. And one of the things that we should be taught is deal with reality. Right?
I think it's, again, going to the environmentalist versus what's the other side? There's the environmental versus genetic or hereditary. Yes.
Yeah.
The idea, most of the people giving criticism, and I can see this because you want to be able to work your way, given the right circumstances, you want to be able to do better. And people get more upset when it's, and I would be upset. I mean, I get that. Like, for me, like, see, I'm not musically inclined. Like, my sister did way better at piano than I did. I just stopped after 2 years because I was bad. And you like to think, oh, but maybe if I had a better environment or whatever. I'm not, but I don't take that as offensive to be like, no, Andrea, we looked at your genetic code and you like, no, you could to a tiny point for putting in the time, but you could never be a virtuoso or whatever, or even like an okay, you know, but who cares? It's piano. Who cares? Like, or it's music. It's like, a lot of people would care actually for music, but like, I don't care. But when it comes to intelligence, it covers so many things of what you can be in society. So you want to be able to work your way up. And so I think people were like, well, I don't want to know, even if it's true, I don't want to know a hard truth. And I kind of, again, where's the utility? I like, other than what you said about maybe helping people who might need more help, or like, but having lower expectations, is that really?
Well, no, I'm not saying, okay, so there's a lot there.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just went off.
No, I want to cover it. So on the musical talent's interesting. So I am a failed musician.
Okay.
I would not be in academia if I could do anything with music. I love music. It's the first thing I ever. Turns out I'm terrible at it.
Okay, so you care about the music thing, yeah.
Yes, and I know the feeling. I would play guitar 10 hours a day 14 hours a day sometimes, and I had friends who were just talented and they were better than I was.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter how much I worked, they were always just a little bit better because they had more talent. That's frustrating. On the other hand, I would rather know it and deal with it and be like, okay, I actually can't become Mozart, right? That it's actually better to know that and to cope with that. That's what, I guess that's one thing there. You know, another thing that I thought of that's interesting is that Francis Galton, who's, you know, widely considered sort of the godfather of behavioral genetics, one thing that one of his biographers, or well, it was in a book. It was taking a biography of him and then looking at how it affected his intellectual development. Is that one thing that was interesting about him is he was obviously a very intelligent person, but he was a little bit less gifted at mathematics than some of his schoolmates were, and apparently this was like he sort of just saw, like, it doesn't matter how much I work. They're always just a little bit better than I am. And that actually just like convinced him of the importance of heredity, right? He realized just like, I just don't have that and I can't be that good. And I think I did that with music. With me, it was just like realizing it with music. Now, the okay, so then getting to I think the racial gap is what you're getting at, which is what people don't want to know because it seems to suggest, yes. So, right, so I do understand that. I do understand that, that feeling, but let's be clear about this. Nobody disputes the fact that there's a roughly 12 to 15, depends on which expert you talk to, let's say roughly a standard deviation gap between blacks and whites in the United States. Nobody disputes that. None of the experts do.
I didn't know that.
Right. So like that's one problem is people aren't even aware of those data. I mean, if you look at mainstream textbooks on IQ, even the very liberal authors are like, yes, there is this gap. Nobody disputes that. The only dispute is
why
is it partially genetically caused? That's it. That's the dispute, right?
Okay.
And I think it's better to know the truth about it, right? Because if you say to me, let's say we find out that it's 10% genetic, 90% environmental.
Okay.
Yeah, let's say we knew that. I would say, wow, that means we better figure something out because we are depressing the IQ of an entire population by a lot. And that's a huge deal. And we should feel ashamed of our society.
Okay.
Whereas if it turns out it's 90% genetic, then look, we still should improve our society. I'm not opposed to that, but we shouldn't be flagellating ourselves quite the way we would be otherwise. Like it's just, I mean, also same thing with discrimination. Like if we're concerned about, well, why is there a disparity in, say, between blacks and whites in STEM fields, and we don't pay attention to IQ differences, we'll never know reality and we'll blame things on discrimination that aren't discrimination. And like, it's weird to me that people don't think that matters. I mean, if you're accusing a group, namely here white people, of being discriminatory racist, that's really hostile. That's a really mean thing to say about somebody, right?
Yeah.
And this is what you're doing is you're blaming them for it, and let's say it's not their fault. Well, that's a problem too. I think we should understand the truth and then try to deal with that. Now, again, it must be said that these are averages, right? So
okay, so that's another thing that needs to be explained because it seems like a deterministic dooming of, oh, I am in this group, this population, that means I can't. Like look at someone like Coleman Hughes, who is brilliant, right?
Or Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is just,
yes.
I mean, one of the smartest people you'll ever run across,
so
right?
People will probably point to these individuals if, say, information comes out that was whatever the degree is of that causing that standard deviation difference. People would be like, well, what about them? But can you explain why? Can you explain how averages work? That like, well, we need to know. Some people don't know.
Okay,
right?
so like, I mean, roughly speaking, with intelligence, it follows a bell curve. That is to say, you can look. So the mean is set at 100. Well, for Caucasians, it's set at 100. For the United States, mean is about 98, 99. But let's just put it at 100 it's easier. Okay, so within 15 IQ points is a standard deviation. So 115 is one and 85.
Okay.
Roughly 66% of the population falls within one standard deviation either way, right?
Okay.
And then it gets, there's a certain empirical rule. I always forget the exact percentage, but you can look it up. But it's like 98% fall within two. And then as you get out, it becomes less and less of a percentage. But if you think about that, so let's say we know the black IQ is roughly 85 and the white is roughly 100 in the United States. That means there's a lot of overlap. In other
So
words,
you know this, or you're using this as the example? We
no,
don't
no,
know
this is a fact. We know this.
Oh.
Yeah, we absolutely know this.
Oh.
What is surprising about that?
I didn't know that.
No. So this is, as I said, there's a standard deviation difference between blacks and whites in the United States. Nobody disputes this. This is.
But some of it could be blamed on, say, economic class, I suppose.
Okay, so there are reasons to think that that's not the cause, but just because there's an economic cause doesn't mean that the outcome doesn't exist, right?
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? So like, we know that the IQs are different, that it's about 85 to 100. Even if the cause is environmental, there's still a difference right now.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So because there's this difference such that you find about 85 and 100. But there's a bell curve, and those bell curves overlap, meaning if you picked out a black person at random, the person might be 130 IQ, might be 70. If you pick out a white person, it might be he or she might be 70, might be 130. You can make some prediction about the individual from the bell curve. I think it's disingenuous to say you can't know anything, because you can't. So you can know a little bit. If you're a Bayesian, you would make certain predictions, but there's plenty of overlap. And again, this is what I want to be clear to anybody who's watching or listening to this, I suppose. Nobody disputes this gap. Nobody in the mainstream literature does. If somebody tells you that that it's a disputed gap, that's a lie. It's not. It is not disputed at all. Nobody who knows the literature would dispute it. Again, the only thing that's disputed is the cause.
Okay. And that's what you think, why you think maybe we should get to the bottom of,
Yeah,
we should continue pursuing?
Absolutely. I think we should. I mean, to put my cards on the table, I think we're going to find out that it's some percentage genetic and some percentage environmental. I'm not sure. I think the best way to think of it is like a probability distribution of what proportion of it is genetic. I'm not sure what I would put that at, but I think some of it's going to be genetic, and I think that's just something we have to accept, probably. I could be wrong. The way that we find out if I'm wrong, though, is we study it and talk about it more honestly and carefully, right? That's what I think is important. And we can't do that if people like Saini have her way and we just rule all of these topics out of bounds by moral law.
It's like, okay, but honestly, like because I didn't really realize that they have actually, like, I knew about the Asian people. Joe Rogan has talked about that.
Yeah.
And also because of like the Harvard situation of people
exactly
limiting how many Asian people are allowed in. And I've heard about the Ashkenazi Jew thing as well, but I hadn't heard about the standard deviation between people of color and then
right. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I actually, well, I don't know if I can say, I reviewed a paper. I guess it didn't get published, but I think I can still talk about it. If I can't, we'll just cut this out.
Okay, sure.
Anyway, it was looking at, do people know this? It asked just average people if they knew about the gap, and then if they had a guess about the magnitude of it. And no, people don't even know it, right? And I think the thing that's a shame about that, maybe it's not necessary that the average person knows it, but for an academic, the reason it's a problem is because the academics who don't know it, when they hear about, say, Rushton or Jensen or people who argued that this gap was genetic, they immediately get hostile and think, who could possibly believe that other than a racist?
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually read even mainstream textbooks, I'm thinking of Earl Hunt's textbook on intelligence. It's a textbook, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
mainstream. Look, there's this gap. We've known this. Every study shows it.
How long have they known?
I mean, since people first started doing intelligence testing, 100 years now.
Okay,
I mean,
sorry, you were saying?
there was a book by Shuey that was, I want to say that was in the 60s, that collected all of the studies up to that point, and there were a lot of them. And then there was a meta-analysis by Roth that looked at like job performance and I think high stakes testing, GRE, stuff like that. I mean, this is in the psychometrics literature, this is not even controversial. No, nobody would bat an eye about it if you said this because everybody knows it. The only thing they would care about is what's the cause.
Okay. So
I mean,
it is learning, like being a new person, learning about this. Like it doesn't, like I don't love that. That's true. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not great. It's not a great feeling to hear like, oh, I thought this was the unknown. I thought this was still part of it, but you're saying it's been known. But I can see why people wouldn't like that.
yeah, so it's interesting because I mean, just about my story, I suppose, which is relevant here. I read The Bell Curve when I was in my 20s. And I remember I just absorbed, like everybody else, this idea that the bell curve was absolute garbage. And then my brother, I think a professor had told him, no, like actually read it. And then my brother had argued with me about it and said, no, like just read it. And I read the bell curve and I was like, wow, like this is very judicious and calm and like,
What is it about literally like a bell curve? Like,
well, yeah, that I mean that plays a role in the book. This is
okay.
the book by Herrnstein and Murray that caused an absolute.
I don't actually know anything about it.
Well, so it's interesting because the book is 1994, and it was more about the way that IQ affects class structure in the United States and like relates to various kinds of behaviors. They had, I think, it's been a while since I read the book actually, but they had two chapters on race and IQ, but really only one that went over it.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody focused on that. And it
Oh,
was
who's
called,
the author again?
Charles Murray was
Oh,
one.
yes, I do know it.
So,
Okay, sorry.
yeah,
I know
yeah,
Charles Murray and
yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah. So
Anyway,
that's
that's
where
that
why
book.
Charles Murray is infamous is because of this book, and it's really crazy because you read the book. First of all, the book's not about race. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's in one chapter, basically. I
I
mean,
sorry, I couldn't remember the name of the book, but yes, I've heard his
yeah,
name and I've heard people go over like it is literally one chapter. Yeah, and he got
yeah, yeah,
a lot
exactly.
of
And
flack for it.
they're so judicious in it when they talk about this, and this is. I mean, I didn't accept what they were saying right away. So I like you, I was like, I was disconcerted by this. I was a Chomskyan radical. I was a very left person, very progressive, heterodox progressive, not easily offended, but very progressive. So I wasn't like happy about this. I was like, I'm going to read everything I can that refutes this view. So I went to the library and I spent like a year challenging the hereditarian position. That is to say, the position that part of the gap, important part, is genetically caused. And I just found the arguments really pretty bad. They were pretty bad. I read, the bell curve wars and collective writings against it and writings against the hereditarian position and James Flynn. And I just saw the arguments were really weak. And at some point, after a year, I felt prepared to just accept to myself that I was a hereditarian. And
Okay.
the thing is, I think like I can understand because people are taught that these people are evil and terrible, and like I heard awful things about Philip Rushton, I heard awful things about Jensen, and so like I'm an open-minded person, but I'm embarrassed to say I shared those opinions because I didn't look into it for myself until after I had read the bell curve and then I got into the literature. And so it was painful for me too. It wasn't like a pleasant experience. I wasn't happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I would still say I'm left of center. I have heterodox views, I think, on human population variation, apparently, but I'm not like some raging conservative or something, which is something people tend to accuse me of. So yeah, I understand that feeling, but at the end of the day, I think truth is usually better. And in this case, I think it definitely is for another reason that we haven't talked about. And this is something I think is important.
Okay.
Is I know lots of people privately who agree with this.
Okay.
Many people who are
Privately. Okay.
private. Exactly. They won't say it publicly, but privately they are. And every one of us knows a lot of these people. And it's this surreal world in which people can't say publicly what they actually believe. And it's like, imagine this world. This is, I don't want to use hyperbole, but it really is kind of 1984-esque, in which you have private beliefs about empirical things in the world that you have to keep private, and that you tell somebody and you feel like you're taking a big risk just to tell another person. Like, that is not a sustainable or decent system. It's also not decent because it allows the most sort of like acrimonious people to monopolize that conversation. Acrimonious, perhaps the wrong word there. The most like white nationalist types, they're the ones who will talk about it because they don't have anything to lose. They don't care. They've already been ostracized, right? Meanwhile, so they're saying something that's, I think, correct. And nobody's arguing that their moral system is wrong, though, right? And that's what bothers me, because like I'm like, let's debate these people and say, look, you don't have to become a white separatist or something. It's just that doesn't follow at all from any of this stuff. Let's
Okay.
not.
I have a question. Sorry. Okay,
Yep.
so
Yeah, no,
here's
go
the chink in the white nationalist armor is that I'm sure there's many, but
I was gonna say, I think there are more
It's
than,
like,
there's
more
probably
than
more
one.
than one.
But like we're not like, if we're gonna go and rank, we're in the middle. You know, like you've got
Yeah,
a few
right,
groups
right.
above us.
Yeah, exactly.
But okay, because here's how we we assign values to intelligence. Humans have assigned smarter better, right? Smarter equals better.
Yeah.
So say
Yeah.
that, I don't know if it's, I don't even want to use, I don't know if I want to use the Ashkenazi Jews. We'll say the Asians, because I don't want
Okay.
the Jews. I don't want to be going there.
We'll leave them out.
I know. So say the Asian population are like, oh yeah, we're totally superior. Like we are, because we're smarter. And it's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
So we're going to do that. And we're going to do, I don't know how to make policies based on any non-Asians living in, I guess we'll say China, because it's the biggest of all Asian populations, but they're going to have like, they're lesser citizens. Or so, like they make,
Right.
we'll say that. They make sort of IQ based sort of citizenry, not citizenry, but like sort of, depending on who's, if you're living there and you're you're visiting and living a landed immigrant or whatever it is, you don't get as many rights because you're not. They sort of develop a sort of, I guess you could say, like racist based on these results. What then? So it's they're almost like Asian nationalists, like white supremacists, but like Asian supremacists. We'll say.
I mean, first of all, I mean, it's interesting because Asians are very nationalistic. Japan's not exactly clamoring for more immigration, right?
Right. Okay. Right. Yes, I suppose.
So to be clear, I think we could distinguish between like, I guess, nationalism and supremacy. So
there is a distinction. I'm meaning it in like transforming, say, using like a white nationalist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi style Aryan race, like peddling type.
Yeah.
But we say that as sort of some dictator in a sort of future world in like the Asian population decides to adopt this.
Right.
And it's true. If we're looking at higher IQs.
It's true that they have a slight IQ advantage, yes.
Okay. So but can we deconstruct why maybe that doesn't, like, why if someone comes against you being like, hey, you promoted looking into this and now look, right?
Well, I mean, first of all, like, just imagine this. Maybe it's easier to imagine it in another country. So
Hmm.
imagine if a Northeast Asian country did do this, and they
Hmm.
said, you know what, like Northeast Asians score a little bit higher on IQ test. We're gonna everybody who's not Asian is a second class citizen.
Yes.
We would find that reprehensible. Even those of us who accepted that that was a real difference, because you don't the way we treat people and say, look, my neighbor might have an IQ of 90. I don't know. I don't care. Maybe he's a really good person. His ethical sort of importance is not tied to his intelligence. And the notion that somebody would say that it is just bizarre to me. I mean, should we tie people's moral value to their ability to run a mile? Because if we did, I would be the first person, I would be in the back of the group, right? I
Okay.
think we can perfectly accept that some people are more intelligent than other people, largely for genetic reasons. And I think we should be able to accept that some groups are more intelligent than other groups, partially at least for genetic reasons. Again, this is an average, on average, and nothing moral needs to follow from it at all. Zero.
Then why
In
do you think
fact,
people are worried about it?
that's a good question. That's a fair question. So that I think people, well, okay, so I think there are two things. One is I do think it undermines some of their preferred policies. I really, like, for example, Head Start or spending more money on education. It does suggest that some of those programs are likely not to work as well as liberals would like them to, right? And I
Okay.
think we have to accept that because that's true. Like it does suggest that that's probably the case.
I don't actually know how that organization works. I'm in Canada, so I've never heard of it
Oh
before.
yeah, I'm sorry. So Head Start's like an early school program in the United States. I think it takes kids when they're like 4 or 5. And anyway, the idea was this is a way to boost cognitive abilities. You get them learning earlier. They
Hmm.
develop these cognitive skills, and what you basically find is they get these cognitive skills, so they go up right away, but then it fades out.
Okay.
And it fades out relative to other people because the other people just catch up a year later, right?
Oh, okay. Okay.
So it
Okay.
doesn't seem to do much in terms of actual boosting intellectual ability.
Okay.
It may have other effects, but it doesn't. It appears. Let's put it this way: people have looked for an environmental way to boost intelligence for a long time. I mean,
Hmm.
Arthur Jensen wrote an article about this famously in 1969 and said basically this isn't working. And it's still not working. I mean, there's some evidence that years of education are associated, or maybe even causally associated with IQ gains, but it's not clear if that's actually. We don't want to get into all the details, but it's not clear that that's actually related to underlying ability or if it's just they're better at taking tests. But
Mm.
even if you accept the positive version of that story, you're talking about a couple IQ points. We're just haven't figured out a way environmentally to boost people's intelligence. And to me, that's not terribly surprising because my guess is I think the way we should think about intelligence is the way we would think about athleticism. You're not going to turn me into LeBron James. It's never going to happen. You could train me from the second I was born and I would not be LeBron James, right? And same I think holds for intellectual ability. So point one is it does undermine some of these policy preferences. But point two is I do just think they're excessively worried. I think in some sense you could call them, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean it in like a sort of straightforward way, paranoid. They're
Okay.
very they're very concerned that any suggestion that one group has better traits on average, on a socially desired trait than another group, could lead to some sort of horrible racism, discrimination, etc. And I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, and I think that concern is legitimate and it's noble in some sense. What I think is ignoble is going farther than the concern and having the conversation about that to denigrating people who study differences, right? That's, I mean, like, look, if we want to have a discussion as you've been having for a long time here, which I think is awesome, about what do we do with this knowledge or why should we study it? That's a discussion we should have.
Mm-hmm.
The discussion we shouldn't have is you call me a racist or a phrenologist or a racial kook or whatever name somebody calls me, right? And then we shut down the conversation. That's what I think is bad. But I think it's excessive worry that is understandable but ultimately misplaced.
Because it does seem like people are intelligence equals value, it feels like.
Yes, yeah. And I think, you know what, it's interesting. I thought a lot about this. I think that tends to be something progressives care more about because they tend to be college educated people. And it's interesting because they pretend that they don't think IQ matters. In fact, some of them deny that IQ even measures anything. But the fact of the matter is, they base their whole identity on intelligence and they mock relentlessly uneducated people. And so I think to them, IQ really is the end all be all. Whereas to me, honestly, like obviously, like, look, I like talking to smart people because I'm smart and I like to talk about intelligent things. But I don't think it's related to human worth. I think there are plenty of decent people who have IQs in the 70s who are just friendly, decent people who try to work wherever and take care of their family. And I think that's noble. I think the construction worker is noble. I think it's unfortunate to associate intelligence with a person's worth that much. Now, again, like I'm not trying to weasel out of the point. I'm not trying to pretend that, you know, I'm sure the average construction worker would rather have a 140 IQ because, you know, just same way I'd rather look like Brad Pitt again. But the fact that I don't doesn't mean I'm like less valuable. And the fact that somebody does construction or even works at Walmart or whatever doesn't mean they're less valuable.
Right.
But I honestly, I find this like, do people really believe that what's keeping Walmart from selling human slaves is that we don't know that there are differences? I mean, I don't. It's just odd to me that the contempt for the state of our morality in society that people would believe that if we find out that there are differences, I guess all of the norms against racism and against treating people differently would suddenly break down and we would be back to Jim Crow South. I don't know.
I think it's a misunderstanding of the history because even I didn't actually realize that, like, because you said you looked into it, that Hitler didn't like IQ tests. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, that's something that kind of makes me think, oh, like, and I do know a lot of it had to do with, like, sort of the Jews as, like, an anti-nationalist, they're like Marxist, capitalist, but also because Marx is Jewish, so communist.
Yeah, they were,
double.
It was Judeo-Bolshevism.
Yeah, so they just looked at everything. Yeah, they took out any little thing, and the things that the race science that we're thinking of, which then there was some eugenics also mixed in there. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, where I live in Alberta, there was a huge eugenics movement actually. Like, in some of the politicians that schools are named after were like eugenicists. So
okay, but I think like the eugenics thing is a really annoying conversation because like
we haven't even talked about it. So yeah.
Right. So and we have to separate like repulsive eugenics from like people who actually okay, so like I say this. Most people are opposed to incest, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, why are you opposed to incest if you are?
I think that there's like a ew gross factor.
Well, there's certainly a yuck factor, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's like a kind of we've seen what happens when you don't like Egyptian kings and queens, like there was incestuous. It goes badly. Things go badly genetically.
Exactly. And so preventing that is a form of eugenics. I mean, the arguments that people make about it, I've had this conversation with many people, is, well, it's potentially bad for the offspring, right?
Right.
Genetically bad for the offspring. Okay, now I wouldn't use the term eugenics because the term has been so thoroughly destroyed that you can't use it anymore. But I do think it's reasonable to like separate evil eugenics, like the really bad stuff. I don't know if I can swear on here.
Oh,
The
I
really
don't
bad.
care. Like, yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't matter.
Okay. PG-13. I'll try to keep
Yeah,
it.
sure.
Okay. So the really bad eugenics and what eventually culminated in the absolute horror of the Nazi regime from people who had like positive views and like really were trying, they thought these ideas were going to be helpful to humanity. Like not every eugenicist was evil. I think it's really important to understand that decent people are sometimes wrong or sometimes right, and people pervert the ideas later. Like it's weird because communism, so like again, let's compare eugenics to communism. Communism has been way worse for humanity, way worse. It's not even close. But communism doesn't have a bad name. I could literally go into my class and say I'm a communist, and it wouldn't really be that big of a deal.
But
People
if you
might think,
say you're a
if I said I'm
eugenicist,
a eugenicist, I might get fired.
hmm.
Right? I mean, isn't that odd when you compare the relative death toll of both of those ideologies? It's not even close. I mean,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, yes, I agree. But I have a okay. What if say that there's a sort of wave of white people who are like, oh, I don't want to muddy my, I want to give my kids a better chance in life. We all know that higher IQ paired with
Mhm,
conscientiousness
mhm,
equals better life. Well, we don't know about the conscientiousness part. We can find
mhm.
out about the IQ. So because I know this population difference, people are vocal about not wanting to, I guess, marry or have
Well,
children with, say, black people or something like that.
yeah, I mean that's getting it. That's
That's the
really
worst.
hard.
That's what people. These. Okay, I'm trying to put
But
myself
do
in
you
a
think
worst case
that
scenario.
do you think individuals should be forced to mate with people
No,
with
no. What if a
right? So
eugenicist thing starts getting a movement again because of this sort of
sure.
studying, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be clear, I think there are reasons. I wouldn't even use the term eugenics. I don't really care about. I don't study like that topic now. I'm not interested
Okay.
in it. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not like worried about dysgenic trends or anything.
Okay.
So that's not like a hobby horse of mine. I'm just trying to defend like some of the people behind it and keep it in context. Now, yes, like I understand that kind of a worry. And I think the best way to handle that is not by lying, it's by addressing the underlying morality. So we can talk, we can say, look, like, we live in a multi-ethnic society. Doesn't matter what you think about that. It's here. We can debate about immigration now, but we've already got it. And what would be the best for everyone here? I think we have a moral obligation. Canada's a little bit different. Canada's a little more homogenous, actually a lot more, I think. But the United States, we have an obligation to the citizens of the United States. And so we have to deal with that. And so if you start promoting ideas that are divisive, that divide one race from another, that's a problem because that's going to decrease well-being in the country, and that's what I care about is well-being. So I would argue against it because I would say it undermines social cohesion, it creates fractiousness, it decreases well-being, etc. I wouldn't lie. I wouldn't
Okay,
say
and it just comes back down to the, well, maybe there are differences, but we don't need to study them because we don't need to know them because it'll cause social cohesion to fall apart.
well, okay, but like again, this is where I think it's really important to teach people that the facts are different from the values, right? I think it's perfectly no, look, like I don't think the president has to be talking about race differences. I don't expect let's say Joe Biden wins that he'll give a speech on race differences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't think that's his job. Scientists' job, our job is to study the world and say what we think is true. That is
Okay.
what we're taught, and that's what I think we should do. In the same way that a journalist's job is to tell the truth, even if it's unpleasant, even if it means your favorite athlete so you're in Canada, so let's say hockey. I guess that's
I'm
big.
not a sports anyone, but anyway.
Okay, well, just for your listeners, let's say hockey. So
Yeah,
let's
sure.
say you're a journalist and you find out this hockey player is using steroids. As a journalist, your job is to report that, even though it's really unpleasant. Same
Right.
thing with scientists. Our job is to report the truth, and then there are other people whose jobs is to talk about the ethical significance, etc. That's like a different process as I see it.
Okay, so I think that I even just hearing you explain about I'm a scientist, that even helps me to differentiate, because that's your job.
Yeah,
Did you, when you explained this on Twitter, how many people were like, "Oh, right, okay, gotcha"?
Not many. That's why I don't know why I participated.
What was the best argument that someone said why you shouldn't be studying this that you saw?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, have I read a really? I hate to say this because I would love to say somebody made a good argument to me because it would feel good to be able to say that, but I really don't think anybody did. I will say, however, there's an article by Earl Hunt, and there's another person on it. I don't remember the other person's name. I apologize, but they made the argument that studying race differences, especially in cognitive ability, it's like working with dynamite. Like you just have to be more careful. So if you're studying, like, I don't know, what kind of food do people like? Who cares? If you're wrong, it doesn't matter. Nobody, you say people like broccoli, they don't. Who cares? You say there are group differences and you're wrong, maybe people really care about that. So they made that argument, and I don't know how I feel about it, but that's a really good it's a paper that like made me think about it carefully. Now there are arguments against that and that we shouldn't have scientific double standards, but that's at least like a reasonable decent argument. What I would say, but there were a few people, I will say, I should be clear about this, who were completely cordial and honestly just had like nice things to say, even though they were highly critical.
Okay.
I love that. I don't mind criticism at all. What I mind is the people who start picking at motives, either lying about the content of the article, which is just embarrassing. Like if you work for the New York Times, take the time to read the article before you say something about it. I mean, that's embarrassing. We'll dismiss that though. And then there are the people who question your motives, and I find that unsavory as well. And people who say, I feel comfortable saying this. So I was in a Twitter conversation with Kevin Mitchell, and I like Kevin Mitchell. And Nate's a really good book, and he writes good articles. And he was basically saying, he was cordial. I'll give him credit for it. But he was saying, well, you have to expect people to speculate about your motives if you say things that like David Duke would approve of.
Okay.
It's just like there's no need for that. It's just odd because like we wouldn't accept people speculating about his motives. Like he wouldn't like that, and I don't either. I mean, I'm used to it, but it's not pleasant.
Right.
It's such a weird thing that like I think he's a really decent person probably, and he's a smart guy, but like to sort of poison the well with the David Duke reference, and then just to be like, well, you kind of, you have to expect people to speculate that you're a racist. And like, why?
Well, it's not really doing any intellectual work. It's just name dropping, and that's easy. And it's just,
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, it's worse than doing no intellectual work. It's actually like taking away intellect from it's like a black hole for the intellect. Like no work would be you just remain silent because you don't know anything, right?
So it's like a negative work.
It is. Yeah, it's a negative. It's like a suck on the world of knowledge. And it's weird because I do know I know very liberal professors, and they would never go public with this, but they might disagree with me, but they will have the debate. They will have it, and it's a good debate, and it's healthy, and they bring up these issues, and I love it. It's this small minority of people who can't handle it, but unfortunately, it's the most vociferous and zealous minority, and they ruin it for everybody, right? Because they start bringing up eugenics, phrenology, genocide, and all this stuff. And then everybody who's decent, but who's like, kind of moderate and doesn't want to get into like a public tussle about it just remains silent.
Right. Yeah.
And
Well,
that's
I know. And the
unfortunate.
people who like might agree mildly would
Mhm.
are like, nah. Well, actually, I mean, well, that's why I'm glad I have this show, so I could talk with you. But I saw your thread. That was what I was reviewing before we chatted, or before I was chatting with you. Was looking through your thread, your 25
Oh
tweet
yeah,
thread
yeah,
on
okay.
Twitter. And I did stay away because I'm like, ooh, dumpster fire. I'm going to just drive right by, right? Because, and I also knew I was going to talk to you, but I mean, I think a lot, like, that's what you're saying. A lot of people who might be like, agree mildly aren't going to go like, you know what? I agree with him. Send.
Right,
And
right. I mean, for example, somebody said, I don't remember who this was, but there are a couple people who even said this. They said to people who were my friends, like, if you defend him, it means I'm going to take that as you're agreeing with him, and therefore, basically, like, you're guilty.
adjacency, you're adjacent.
Yeah, adjacency. Yeah, exactly. You don't want to be like Winegard adjacent. That's like a problem, apparently. And like, I don't know. Yeah. And so, like, look, like, if you don't know the topic particularly well, like, I'm not accusing you of being ignorant or something, but you're
No.
not. You're not a psychometrician. You're not interested in the literature as much as I am, obviously. I would stay out of it if I were you too.
Okay.
There's nothing to gain. I mean, the only thing I would say if I were you is people should be able to talk about this. I support free speech, and that's that. I wouldn't say anything else because it's not worth it.
I'm going to
Right?
write, I support free speech next time you have, there'll be a next
There,
time.
there you go. Like, just I support free speech, and we should all support it. Thumbs
And then
up, right?
I'll look and see how that goes for me.
Uh,
Who
well,
knows?
I'll defend you.
Yeah, well, who knows how many people, but I mean, I bet that even that could be suicide, like, I support free speech. Well, what are you saying? Well, what do you mean by free speech? What do you mean? Like, what about hate speech? Hate speech isn't free speech. Like, that goes down its own separate.
Well, what was
Anyway,
your 100,000 video on Peterson? I'm
I
assuming was
know.
supporting his free speech.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was.
Okay, so there you go. Free speech is actually popular.
It is. Yeah, it is on YouTube, on
Yeah,
Twitter.
it is. It is on YouTube, on Twitter. Well, you know what? It's interesting because, like, I don't know when this happened, but somewhere along the line, when you get to about 10,000 followers, you start to pick up a lot of people who follow you just because they hate you.
Hateful. Well, even I even have a friend who's like, I think got about 2,500 followers, and he's do you know Scientific Bird, Inquisitive Bird, and he's got a
Yeah,
great yeah, he's
yeah,
one of my friends. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So yeah, he does these amazing threads, these scientific threads,
Yeah,
all based on
yeah,
data. That's why I love them, because it's like
yes.
the
Great.
data, it's right there. He points to it, right? But he
Right.
has hate followers, maybe about two. So, but he's
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
like not even at the 10,000 mark, and he has a couple hate followers. So
yeah, absolutely. I bet he does. And then what happens is it seems as though it's almost exponential. So you get like 6 and then 20, and then pretty soon you've got a lot of people who just follow you, and they're like, for
to
me,
crap on
probably
you,
they're like the social justice warrior types who
yeah,
follow me. And so, like, now what happens? So, like, I mean, I've been writing about race for 5 years or something, and like, I'd post an article and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. And then this one,
it just
this
attracts
one,
so much attention.
yeah, all of a sudden people, they really glommed onto the phrenology thing. But then I have like these people, and another thing is people just abhor Quillette, right? I mean, there are lots of people who hate Quillette, and
Mm-hmm.
they sort of just see an article, they see race and they see Quillette,
Quillette.
and they're like, this is the worst ever.
Yeah, yeah. I actually,
You
when
know?
I saw it, I was like, what direction are we going here? Like, I was a little like, what are we gonna see when I click on this?
Well,
And
I tell you what, I give credit to the editors there for publishing it because they had to know they were opening themselves up to a
yeah,
lot
good
of
for
criticism.
them. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think that maybe this is a good space to wrap up. Is
Oh,
there anything else that you wanted to cover that we didn't?
Oh, wow. So we covered so much. I'm trying to run through it.
I kind of
And
think we did.
I guess what I would say is that this is my like standard like concluding shot
Okay.
is look, like we're gonna find group differences in psychological traits. So it's like it seems inevitable that we're going to. We already know some, and probably differences in cognitive ability. And I don't think that has to be a bad thing. I think we should have the conversation judiciously, of course, because I care about these things, but honestly and candidly. And the more that we do this and the more that we realize it's not the end of the world and that there are plenty of cosmopolitans, which I am, liberal type cosmopolitans who think that there are differences and it's not the end of the world, the better we will be and the more mature these conversations will be. Because I cannot tell you how unpleasant. Now, again, I try to be, I probably have the right constitution for this because yeah, I like intellectual excitement. I won't lie about it. I like topics that are kind of forbidden. They're interesting. They're more challenging, if you will. But also, I can take abuse pretty well.
Yeah.
people people hate me, and that's fine.
Oh,
But
I wish I could get a little of that, but yeah.
yeah, well, I tell you what, there seems to be definitely a sex difference in it. Just
Oh,
on average, women are a little more agreeable and a little more socially anxious. So,
right.
criticisms a little, things that bother Corey, for example, they just don't bother me. So
Right.
Corey, that is. I
Yeah.
mean, like, and I mean, I think she's pretty ballsy. I guess that's a bad word to apply to a woman, but
Yeah, we catch your meaning. Yeah.
okay, yeah. But like even like the difference between us, I notice it's just like I just don't care as much.
Yeah.
I don't remember what my point was. I was not trying to.
I think that you're just saying you have a good constitution for
Yeah, but
going in this
I sound as
direction.
though I'm boasting or something, and I'm not trying
No,
to.
you're saying I think you're just saying you can handle it.
Oh yeah, I can handle it, but it's an unpleasant conversation when I'm just getting accused of things, and I'm
Yeah.
sure it's unpleasant for a lot of other people that I talk to who talk about these things. I know that it's not fun for them. And that's just too bad. I mean, human variation to me is the most fascinating thing on the planet. It
Hmm.
really is. It's so interesting that there are differences in personalities and differences in phenotypes. And I mean, it's weird because progressives are like, celebrate diversity. It's really cool. But then you say, well, groups are different. And then they're like, wait, you're a racist.
What?
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's weird. It's like, no, I really do think diversity is interesting and cool.
You're like,
And
I agree.
yeah, I do agree. And it's an important part of human evolution. It tells us about human evolution. So there are so many reasons it's fascinating and that people would be interested to study it. And
Hmm.
I hope that the conversation slowly gets a little bit better. That's my sort of chief goal in talking about these things, is just to make the conversation a little bit less pleasant and a little more focused on the facts and the data and the theory.
Right. And we can have the conversations after we have figured out what the is part of the theory.
Yeah,
We can
absolutely.
go in the, well, should we implement this, that, or the other? Is that, what kind of connotations will this have on us? Which way do we want to avoid?
Yeah,
In the moral sphere, we can talk about those things.
absolutely. I mean,
Hmm.
I absolutely, we can't, no, I would just, the only point I would make about is I don't feel as though I'm like an ethical expert,
Right. So
like,
that's why you're hanging back onto the, well, let's find out what
exactly.
is 1st. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And then, no, I mean, I'll write about ethics from time to time, but I'm not any wiser than anybody else.
Right.
So yeah,
Okay. Okay.
but that's what I think and what I'm trying to do.
Okay. Well, thank you for chatting with me. I think that this
Absolutely.
hopefully clears things up or ignites more fires. We'll
Yeah, we'll see,
we'll
right?
see. I know.